You're listening to Quantum Revolution with Karen Curry Parker, exploring new frontiers in consciousness, science, and evolution. Join us in intimate conversations with cutting-edge scientists, spiritual leaders, artists, disruptors, and visionaries who are working towards reframing the narrative of our future by healing the rift between spirituality and science, reclaiming creativity, and laying the foundation for a new world. And now, here's your host, Karen Curry Parker.
My afternoons are usually filled with lots of moaning and tears. Afternoons in my house means doing math with my 12-year-old. It's not uncommon for the air to be filled with the expression, "But this is meaningless to me," on repeat. Like good parents, well trained by an educational system that endorses the idea that children often have to be bribed or coerced to learn for their own good, we plow through math homework. My daughter doesn't really need a lot of pushing from us. She's already intrinsically terrified of being shamed at school for not having her homework done. Maybe if you're a parent, you relate to this. Or if you can stretch your mind back to your own experiences in school, you had similar experiences. Maybe it wasn't with math, maybe it was with PE or reading. Education has become systematized. If you study the history of the education system in America, you'll read that education was deemed necessary for a healthy democracy and for building a compliant workforce in the industrial era. Compulsory education's birth was marked with children being taken off their parents' fields and marched to school at gunpoint. We are taught that an education is a vital component of success. We define education as going to school, whether through public schooling or the more expensive version of the same concept, private schooling. Children are shepherded through a system that makes learning a 12-year-long process of mastering how to follow the rules and perform for rewards. About 33% of children in the school system manage to do well. Some even thrive. But what about the other 66%? Even more frightening, approximately 30% of children in the United States have been diagnosed, and some are even medicated for, having learning problems. Have we really bought into the idea that only 33% of us are smart and capable of success? Could 30% of children be incapable of learning or be somehow educationally broken and often in need of medication to make them compliant? On today's Quantum Revolution, we're talking to Naomi Fisher, a clinical psychologist, about her new book, Changing Our Minds: How Children Can Take Control of Their Own Learning. According to Fisher, children today have easy access to an enormous amount of information from all around the world. The news is not hidden from them, and much of the news is not reassuring. In addition, most of them spend their days in an environment that makes very specific competitive requirements of them, over which they have almost no power. When they refuse to cooperate with this, they are said to be suffering from school refusal or perhaps school phobia. This is often thought of as an irrational anxiety, a bit like being scared of spiders. But is it irrational to refuse to go to school? Instead of assuming that distressed children must be disordered, let's think about whether school is an environment in which all children can thrive.
Hi, and welcome to Quantum Revolution. I'm Karen Curry Parker, and I'm here today. I don't even know what to say because I have been so excited for this interview for so long. I am with Dr. Naomi Fisher, who is technically, I guess, an educational psychologist. Is that a good title? No?
Clinical. I'm a clinical psychologist. Yeah.
Perfect. And Dr. Fisher has written a new book that will be coming out in the United States in December called Changing Our Minds, which really does an incredible job of exploring a theme that I think is a terrifying theme for a lot of us who have been deeply entrained and conditioned by the educational system, and that is the possibility that if we let children follow their own direction, they could actually end up getting a better education than if we sit them down in a chair and repeat information to them over and over again for 12 years under the guise of creating active participants in our culture. So welcome, Dr. Fisher. I want to unpack this topic so deeply because I think as I kept reading, as I was reading your book, I kept thinking, this is an idea that frightens people. And I want to know, why are people so afraid to embrace the idea that children actually want to learn? Let's start with that.
Well, I think it comes down to what was done to most of us as children. That when we go to school, one of the very first things we're told is you need to listen to what the teacher says, and the teacher knows better than you what you need to learn. And we go through the schooling process. We go through 12 or 13 years of being told teachers know best. Adults know best what children need to learn. Children cannot be trusted to make those choices for themselves. And the funny thing is that we don't realize we're learning that at school, because school doesn't tell us that they're teaching us that. School says we're teaching you maths and English and science and whatever else. There's this curriculum that we learn underneath all that about our place in the world, how learning works. And then when we grow up and become parents ourselves, most of us have never questioned that bit of it. We might have thought, I didn't think I learned much maths at school, or I didn't think I learned much science, but we're very unlikely to challenge the kind of basic assumptions of how school worked. And that basic assumption that children cannot be trusted and need to be made to do things runs through the education system, runs through pretty well every school that I have come into contact with.
It's an interesting irony, because what I'm hearing you say is that we're entrained to follow along and be in the system and do what we're told. And at the same time, we have this expectation for young adults that once they emerge out of the school system, they should be connected to their own inner authority and have a deep sense of what they need to do and how to do it. And yet, I think what we see is when children, young adults get out of school, oftentimes without the structure, they flounder. Would that be a correct assessment?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the deep ironies of the way our education system works is that the people who have most choice and most autonomy are the youngest children, like the 3 and 4-year-olds. Those are the kids who we put in often in a really high quality preschool nursery environment. You put them into an environment of choices and you let them choose. And they make different choices, they do different things, and we support them in their choices. And then it's like the moment that they kind of get old enough to persuade, we're like, right, okay, all the choices are over. Now we're going to control you. We're going to decide what you're going to do. And it doesn't fit with how I understand psychological development. It doesn't really fit with how we understand cognitive development. And it doesn't fit with lots of new discoveries about neuroscience and about how actually, in order to learn how to make choices, in order to be a great problem solver, someone who feels like you can take charge of your life, you need lots of practice with doing that. And what better time to practice than in childhood, when you're protected from the consequences of your choices? We have this strange system where we put children into an environment where they have very few choices. We say, basically, your 2 choices are you comply and do what you're told, or you don't, and then you're a rebel. And then we're going to try harder to get you to comply. And then they get to the end, age 18 maybe, and suddenly the stakes are so much higher. They're outside of the home. They have to worry about things like earning a living, looking after themselves in all sorts of other ways. And this is the first time many of them have made meaningful choices about their life. Why is it a surprise that at that point they flounder? And it's the kids who do really well who flounder as well. It's not the kids who are struggling in school who necessarily flounder. It's the ones who followed all the rules, done everything they were told. You get out the end and it's like, now what happens? And I've learned how to deal with this situation of actually, now it's up to me.
We have a phrase in America, and between my husband and I, we have 8 children. And all of them, except for our littlest, they're all in their 20s and 30s. And they keep throwing around this phrase of adulting. I don't want to do adulting. How is it that you have a choice about this? And there's a resistance, though, around, and I think that resistance, frankly, is rooted in anxiety because they've never had that experience. I want to go back and hit on something you just brought up, because one of the things that comes up a lot in our conversations on quantum revolutions is a dialogue around creativity and a dialogue around how sometimes the expression of creativity is managed and controlled. The choices of children in school is to either comply or be a rebel. again, I don't know how it is where you are, but here in the United States, we have like almost a 30% diagnosis rate of children with ADD. And I don't even know how much the medication rate is. And I was listening to a podcast that you were on, and one of the things that you had talked about is you were seeing in your practice children who refuse to go to school. And you were tasked to basically decondition their anxiety and get them back into the school building and back in compliance with school.
Yes. So I would be seeing these kids. I worked in several different settings where I was working with children, including one where we were diagnosing children with ADHD. And I was working with these children and I was thinking the assumption that we have here is that school is the right place for these children. And the children are somehow, there's something wrong with the child, really. There's something irrational maybe about the child's desire not to go to school, or maybe the child has got some kind of neurodevelopmental condition, which means that, they need extra help with school. But the assumption is always that school is a good thing. School is the right place for your child to be. If a child is functioning properly, they'll be in school. And so, yes, I was trying to get kids back into school. And I did, as a new psychologist, I did it. And I remember writing letters being very disapproving of parents who actually decided to take their children out of school. Because the way I was conceptualizing it as a psychologist, I was seeing that I was hypothesizing that they weren't going to school because they were anxious about it. And as a clinical psychologist, if someone's anxious about something, then the answer is often to let's try and reduce that anxiety through using desensitization or cognitive behavior therapy. And then when I had my own children, I started thinking, but this school environment, it's not the only way to learn. It's a very unnatural environment, really. Why should we put all the children of the same age in the same place, require them to do a curriculum, require them to comply with adults, require them to move through this system? What if actually lots of these kids who are refusing to go are actually the most sane children? They are the ones who are holding up the flag and saying, hang on a minute, there is something really wrong here. And I came to really value the voices of those children who were saying, no, I'm not having this. This is not what works for me. And I thought, what would happen if we put that at the center of our understanding of education, the child's knowledge about what they want and what they need, as opposed to this adult top-down knowledge about school is good for you. You must be at school. Let's try and get you into school.
I want to weave this back to something else that I've been talking a lot this season with different people. I see this epidemic of children and adults. And I have a 12-year-old. All of her friends talk about, we have anxiety. My adult children have anxiety. Several of them are actually on medication for anxiety. And I'm wondering if that anxiety isn't an inner symptom of saying, hey, this isn't working for me, and not having a place to be able to, in a healthy way, say, time out. When you're shaming me in the classroom, this isn't working. I don't want to be shamed. So how do you feel about that, or what do you think about that?
It's such an interesting phenomenon, I think, at the moment. You're right. There's something about the generation at the moment where they describe their emotions in terms of psychiatric diagnosis often, or they describe the way they are in terms of psychiatric diagnosis. And I think, a different way of, so the psychiatric diagnostic model says that things like anxiety are symptoms. It puts them as sort of symptoms of a disease, which the obvious treatment is to go and get medication or maybe go get psychotherapy. But basically you see them as a symptom, which means you don't necessarily examine the meaning. You don't say, I wonder what it is you're anxious about and why you're so anxious, whether maybe you have good reasons to be anxious. And maybe that anxiety is telling you something about how you need to live your life, or maybe it's telling you something about the world around you. I actually think a lot of our children's anxiety at school is telling us that we need to change that school system, because it's not inevitable. It doesn't have to be like that. The adults, we're the ones imposing that on them. How about if we said, you know what? I don't think it's 30% in the UK. It's more like 15 to 20%, but we have 15 to 20% being diagnosed with some kind of special educational needs. What about if we really listened to what those kids are saying and thought, how could we arrange things so actually everybody could learn and thrive here? What about if we saw this anxiety as another red flag, saying something's not right here, something's not right here? And when we locate it in the child or in the individual, we say, okay, maybe you have a medical disorder, you need medication. We basically depoliticize that anxiety. We stop thinking about it as something that maybe means we should be changing. something about the environment.
I think that's a very sobering thought, that if we have such an epidemic of children who are clearly saying something's amiss, and our tendency to say, well, what's wrong with you, kid, instead of saying, wait, there's a massive there's one in England, in your case, 1 in 25.
Yeah.
And here it's even, I think, even more. How many, these kids are saying we are the canaries in the coal mine. And
how many do we need? How many of them do we need? Yeah.
When are we going to say maybe we can't medicate half of the population? That's not okay.
Well, medication, what is it doing? It's just kind of flattening that anxiety, and maybe we need it. I mean, I see some people who are very anxious about climate change, for example. And I'm thinking, okay, so we say someone's anxious about climate change, we give them medication, they're now less anxious about it. But climate change is happening. Maybe we need this anxiety. Maybe it's the way humans respond. And that anxiety is what's going to give us a push to change something. And when we dampen it all down, it stops that momentum for change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you talk a lot about self-directed learning. What is self-directed learning?
So the way I define self-directed learning is that it's learning that's chosen by the learner and where the learner can choose when they want to stop. So it doesn't really reflect, it's not a particular pedagogy. There are many different ways of doing it. At home, it's often called unschooling. It often goes on in democratic schools or learning communities. But the basic premise is that it's not imposed on you by somebody else. So other people might make suggestions, but the learner or the child or young person really is the one who can say, you know what, that's what I want to do. Or you know what, that isn't what I want to do right now. That's not meaningful for me. So that puts meaning and purpose at the center of what children are learning and what they're doing. And I think it's really the best way to do that, because you can never know for somebody else what they'll find meaningful and purposeful. Certainly not as they get older. Parents are often quite good at doing that with their young children. They know what kind of things will engage them. Even then, within young children make such different choices. I have a nephew who's 2 at the moment. He's totally into diggers. That's all he's interested in. He's in this wonderful environment full of stuff to do. Diggers is all he wants to do. I've got another nephew who's 4. He's totally interested in bats. That's what he's, they find what they're interested in. And then they do this great thing where they pull in the adults to support them in that. Basically my nephew's got his grandparents taking him down to see the digger every day. My daughter, who's 10, she made my little nephew with the bat. She made him a special bat phone. They bring in all this kind of stuff for themselves. And I think that's so amazing when you see that a child latches on something. They're like, wow, this is really interesting. And then the learning just flows. There's just it just is amazing to see when a child's interested. And we know that with our young children. We see it with our young children. And for some reason, collectively as a culture, collectively like the whole Western world culture, we kind of think when they get to 4 or 5, everything's changed. And there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence that we start learning in a different way. There's no evidence that your brain works in a different way just because you're 5 now and now you learn better by being seated at a desk. It just doesn't make sense. That's what I think.
If a child then is, I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a minute, because I can hear my parents talking in the back of my head. As you and I discussed before we went live, I homeschooled my children. I unschooled my children for 11 years, to my parents' utter horror. And they still say my adult children are not normal because of these choices. So how would you address the fear, the collective fear that if you just simply allow children to do what they want to do and just go pursue in great depth a study of dragons, say, or unicorns or some fantasy creature, how are they going to get the skill set that they need to become people who can work in the workforce, and people who, inevitably as part of being an adult are going to have to suck it up and do things they don't want to do because that's life. How do you address that?
So for a start, I think it's a complete illusion that what happens to children in school prepares them for this future life. School is kind of based on this idea that you can learn a cumulative amount of stuff, almost like you're filling up your backpack with knowledge, and then you leave school and there you are, you've got your backpack of useful skills all ready to draw out when you need them. It doesn't work like that. If you ask anybody what they remember of their time of school, most people will tell you all about how they remember maybe the playground, or they remember this really annoying teacher, or the food that they had in the cafeteria, they're very unlikely to tell you about the contents of the curriculum. If they do, it'll be a few things. It will not be 12 or 13 years worth of learning. We just don't work like that. So for a start, I think there's a question about, do schools actually prepare young people for that? But then I think there's something else about how really what do we need as adults? And I think the capacity to know that you can learn something when you want to learn it, and that you know yourself and how you work, is what will take you through pretty well your adult life. And I think, unfortunately, what we do to children at school takes that away from them. So in the hope that, if you think about it, the school system takes this approach, right? It's so important that young children learn English, math, science, all this curriculum content, that we're going to take away their control over their lives in order to make them do that. It's absolutely crucial that they do this. So it's worth taking away the control and taking away their trust in themselves, perhaps. Self-directed learning says it's not worth it, because actually, what does that curriculum do? They can look it up in later life if they want to. If they're really interested in science, they can learn it. But actually, to relearn that sense of yourself as an active learner, which all kids have when they're young, that's really hard to relearn in adulthood. So I think it's partly about knowing about how humans learn best and what they learn best at different stages of their lives. Because we spend a lot of time, particularly in primary school, I think you call it elementary school, where we're teaching kids stuff that they find really, really hard, like fractions and decimals and reading and all this kind of stuff. They find it really hard because they're young and because their brains are at a stage where really what they want to do is play and run around. And we're getting them sitting in desks and focusing and all this stuff they find really, really difficult. What about if we took account of what we know about neurobiology and we said, well, maybe, the under 10s, they work really well when they're allowed to play, run around, do what they like. And then when they get a bit older, they actually get a lot better at this sitting down at a desk, concentrating business, much better at it from their own. So why don't we do that when they find it easier? Or why don't we let them do that when they find it easier? And I think you really see that with self-directed kids. Like my son, he's 13 now. He did no formal maths at all until he was 11 or 12. And then he went to this self-directed learning community where they have the possibility to have maths lessons if you want them. It's optional. And in a year of maths, he's gone from no maths at all through to doing quadratic equations and trigonometry because he loves it. He's just like, this is so great. And I can just see that if we'd had 10 years of, well, not 10 years, however, 8 years of trying to make him do maths beforehand, we would absolutely not be here.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. When my oldest son did not learn to read until he was 9, which is technically very late. But within 3 weeks, he read the entire Harry Potter series. He could not stop reading,
Exactly. The school rules don't apply, like being a late reader. 9 to me doesn't sound very late anymore. It did when I started out, but now I'm like 9. That's really typical. That things can be learned very quickly and efficiently when you're interested, and it's a really inefficient way to make somebody learn something that they're not interested in. And we know that, when I'm being made to learn something I'm not interested in, it's really hard work. Whereas when I learn stuff because I love it, wow, I just go, or when I need it. It's not even when you necessarily love it. It's when you need it and you're like, this has purpose and meaning for me, so I'm going to learn it.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, this sort of has me thinking too, I own a publishing company. So my big things that I've been bemoaning over the last few years is people don't read anymore. Why aren't they reading? And also, again, this is maybe specific to America. There's also sort of a cultural bias against education, not education, but learning. So it's almost as if once you graduate, or whether you get your college degree or your high school degree, that's it. You're done. You've learned everything. You don't have to ever go study or learn anything again. Let's go. Again, this is a very gross way of saying this, but there's not, we sort of classify people who like to learn or who would choose to spend their weekend reading rather, as being problematic and kind of strange
or geeky
or nerdy. And I wonder how much of this almost reactionary hatred for things like reading or learning or going to even a live performance, a play, a Shakespeare play, it is like really
not popular and almost like, why would we do that? I'm wondering what you think about the impact of school on our long-term curiosity and creativity.
I think it's such a basic human reaction. You make people want to do something and they don't want to do it anymore. And it goes, there are loads of studies, psychology studies, which show even something that people enjoyed beforehand, if you manipulate them into doing it, and this is with even rewards and punishments, right? So if you shift their locus of control, there are these great studies from the 1970s with preschoolers drawing felt tip pen pictures. And the adults came along and they started rewarding them for drawing these felt tip pen pictures. And these were kids who liked to draw, right? Little kids, they liked drawing. And they found that once they'd started rewarding them for drawing the pictures, when they stopped, the ones who'd been rewarded, they didn't want to draw as much anymore. Whereas the kids who'd never been rewarded, they kept going because they were doing that drawing because they wanted to. And even by rewarding, and often parents don't realize that rewarding can have a similar effect in terms of control. When you reward a child for doing something, you give them the message, I want you to do this. And so much so that I'm going to try and coerce you into doing it. And schools do that right from day one. Unfortunately, right from day one, it's all about how can I mold you to doing what I want you to do rather than what you want to do. And I think you do that to someone for 12 or 13 years, and of course they're going to go, why would I carry on doing this? And Shakespeare's a great example. There's some, can't remember what it is, there's some article I read which was saying, all these things should be compulsory. Beethoven should be compulsory. There should be so much more music that's compulsory. And one of the responses said, yeah, but look at what that did to Shakespeare. Like, here we have to study, in the UK, we have to study Shakespeare pretty well every year in secondary school. When you're 11, when you're 12, when you're 13, when you're 14, you do a Shakespeare play. Who are the people who go to see Shakespeare for pleasure? Very, very few. Very few. It kills enthusiasm. And I think most people know that. I write about that a bit in my book, actually, that as a young person, I was an avid reader. I read books all the time. I read really challenging books all the time. I couldn't be stopped from reading. Like, I would even be reading under my desk in the lessons I found boring. And then except when the book was assigned for school, and then suddenly I had to literally count my way through the pages. And I remember thinking as a 14-year-old, what is going on here? I love reading. This book is a good book. But somehow knowing that I've been told I've got to read 50 pages for homework killed it for me, completely killed it for me. And I think we just see that all the time. And it's such a basic human reaction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to just say, for any of our listeners who are perhaps really sort of feeling that conditioned response about, oh, you can't just let kids follow their own path. I wanted to say, I let my children do this. I created an environment where my children could stay true to their natural essence, right? And I want to just say, on the tail end, my oldest is now almost 31. I have several children of ours have master's degrees. They've fulfilled all the metrics for higher level educational success, and they love learning, and they continue to really love learning. But one of the things that I always think about is, when we schooled our children at home, we had a homeschool cooperative, and it was obviously multi-aged, and children of different ages would hang out together and learn together. I mean, it was not an unusual thing to see a 16-year-old boy walking around at the park at our homeschool meetings with a baby on his hip. And I always think about that just in terms of what a beautiful thing to foster, especially now as we have these conversations about gender and gender roles collectively as well. But the other piece that was so profound was watching the children grow up in an environment where they were divorced from this idea that, 7-year-olds do this, 8-year-olds do this. Talk to me about multi-aged learning.
I think you're right. It's amazing to see. But I think there's you've just mentioned something at the end there that I think is so important. It's that when you put children in a group of children of the same age and you tell them we're all going to learn the same thing, you invite comparisons by everybody. The parents, the kids. My own son, he went to preschool and he was very young in his year, and he had a lot of trouble drawing. He still does, actually. And he came back after like a few mornings of preschool playgroup and said, I'm no good at drawing. I can't draw anymore. And one of the things I really love about the multi-age thing is that just doesn't become an issue for them. I see in my children, my son has never been in an age group like that since preschool, which was when he was 3. They don't even have an awareness of who would be in their school year group. So they are not checking round in the same way as I see school children going. They're not sort of thinking, oh, they can all read, I can't read. They can do this, I can't do this. There isn't the same competitive comparisons, which is just amazing. But also, there's something so powerful about learning things from other children, something that's so different to learning things from adults. The hierarchy is different. The power structures are different. My son, when he was young, was one of these amazing kids who was completely resistant to any kind of instruction. So he led me here totally. It was his, he's the one who brought me there, because I used to joke anything I would say to him. If I'd say, I've got a great idea, how about we, go to the aquarium? He'd be like, no, mummy, I have a better idea. And that was basically the mantra to his young childhood. I have a better idea. We're going to do something else. And I used to say that basically by suggesting things, I would almost kind of taint them. He wouldn't want to do that thing anymore. He's so super sensitive to pressure. And he plays Minecraft. I don't know if your kids played Minecraft or if they're too old. But anyway, I thought he would love Minecraft when he was about 5 or 6. And I tried to suggest it to him. And he was like, no, that's not. He could feel the pressure from me. And for 2 years, he refused to touch Minecraft. Every time I said, hey, I've got this game on, he was like, no, boring, until he met another older child we happened to meet at some homeschool group. And she had this great house she'd built in Minecraft. He was like, wow, can we get this game? And I was like, yes, let's get this game. But there's something magic that happens in the dynamic between mixed age groups of kids, because there's so much sharing going on. And there's so much stuff that they bring in that I wouldn't think to bring in, for example, because they're just sort of developmentally, they're closer, but they're still far apart, as it were. So there's still, and you can see, I think it's really important for kids to be able to see what kind of progression I might make, what kind of things might I learn. I think it's particularly important for kids who aren't in the school system, because in the school system, you can see where you're going step by step by step by step by step. And I think it's hard sometimes for kids who aren't there to think, what will I be like when I'm a teenager, when all the other teenagers are really stressed about their exams, and what will I be doing? And it's good for them to be able to see the future. It's good for their parents as well, definitely, because that also takes a lot of the fear out of it, I think, for parents, if they can see, yes, the teenagers are okay, they are learning, and, we could be there too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it also addresses the second issue that when I was homeschooling, my parents would bring up. Well, what about socialization?
It's an international concern, that one.
And, I think these, my kids are able to communicate effectively across multiple age ranges and they're able to go to other adults in the community and say, hey, we had a pilot in our group, and one of my kids was like, I want to learn about aerodynamics and how do airplanes fly, and he could go and ask, and it wasn't like, well, that's an adult, I shouldn't talk to them. And
I've noticed that as my children have got older, you see the difference between how schooled children have learned to react to adults. Basically, they think that they might be going to be caught out or that they're going to be asked a question or tested in some way. And the way in which self-directed children respond to adults is really different.
It's different. And I think it's also, I've been trying to articulate this for a long time. I think there's also just a difference in the way in which they've learned to communicate or be communicated with.
It's holding themselves in the world, I think. They've learned, they expect to be treated with respect and to treat others with respect. And sadly, often in school, children aren't treated with respect and they have very little power.
Yeah, no, I would say for sure. I mean, I think, again, I have a 12-year-old spy in the school system right now who comes home and reports to me, Mom, why do they talk to us like we are cows and they're herding us through the playground? She does not come from a home where she's shamed or yelled at as a way of trying to enforce her cooperation. And it's still very foreign to her, even though she's been in the school system her whole life. So we always like to end our interview with asking our experts, what do you envision for the world of the future? If you could construct the educational system in a way that you think best facilitates and grounds children into connecting with their inner authority, staying connected with their curiosity and their longing for learning, what would it look like?
Well, I think it would look very, very different for a start. I mean, I think for quite a long time, for maybe up to the age of 9 or 10, It would simply look like places where children can go meet each other, play, access resources, access other caring adults. I think that the relationships with other adults is really important, particularly maybe for children who come from backgrounds where they have less access to resources at home, fewer books at home, or where their parents don't speak the dominant language. They need to be out there learning, meeting other adults as well as in their family. And then what I would like to see really is that schools were places of opportunity, so that you knew that if you were going to school, there was going to be so many different opportunities for you that you couldn't access at home. And so that, if you were really passionate about learning to be a pilot, it would be somewhere you could go and do that. And you knew that at school you'd have extra resources to do that. But I also think that it has to be a choice, because there's something fundamental about people who want to be somewhere as opposed to people who are made to be there somewhere. So what I would really like to see is a diversity of options in education. I would like it to be that not that this one size thing fits everybody, but I would like it to be, okay, so maybe we have these places that are more like learning centers where you can go and access resources and adults and other kids and everything. Then maybe there are some traditional schools. So if you really want to do that, you can go and do that. And there are maybe ways that we can facilitate homeschooling for those who would prefer to be homeschooled. And maybe if their parents can't do it, we can have co-op. So I would just like it to be much wider, much more of like, children are really diverse. They need diversity of options. Parents are diverse too. So let's accept that in the education system rather than trying to pretend that isn't the case and kind of corralling everybody through the same system.
Beautiful, beautiful. So share with us again the name of your book, Changing Our Minds. What is your beautiful subtitle?
It's how children can take control of their own learning.
You can get Dr. Fisher's book on Barnes & Noble in the United States and Amazon. It'll be out in December. In other places around the world, it's already out. Go grab a copy, especially if you're a parent or a grandparent and you're really contemplating. I think after this whole COVID thing, we've had kids at home. It's worked for a lot of us. And you're really wondering, how do I go forward and continue to live in a way that's aligned with our core values, that really supports and nurtures our children in becoming the fulfillment of the potential of the future of our world. Go get Dr. Fisher's book, and your mind will be blown. We read it together in our family all weekend. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for having the courage to really shine a light on this topic. I think it takes a lot of courage to say, hey, the emperor is naked.
Thank you, Karen. It's been great to be here.
We've talked to several scientists and thought leaders this season about the importance of a healthy foundation for life. When we get disconnected from the value of life and the arc of time that is the lifespan of a human, it's easy to forget that being a child isn't a static state. Children grow into adults who are eventually tasked with running the world and creating the future we dream of. We are potentially facing a series of global challenges that will threaten the well-being of all life on the planet. And yet, during this time when we need to tap into our innate creative power at our highest level, we're struggling with a massive crisis in creativity and critical thinking. The metrics for creativity have been significantly declining since 1990. The Torrance test, used for decades by researchers to measure creativity, is actually a better predictor of real-world success than traditional IQ tests. Researchers at the University of William and Mary analyzed 300,000 Torrance test scores since the 1950s and found that creativity scores began to nosedive in 1990. While we can blame computers or overscheduled lives for this crisis, we might also have to reckon with the idea that some of this crisis is being amplified by our education system. We have a school system that has normalized the system of punishment and reward, a way of motivating children that has been proven again and again to actually decrease creativity and, over time, decrease compliance. We have a culture that has normalized the experience of bullying and being bullied in school. It's so normal that most of the young adult fiction that has won any kind of book award in the last few years centers around the theme of bullying. Just this week in the news, a 10-year-old Black girl with autism killed herself because she was being bullied. I have long held the view that disempowered children have to seek their normal human need for power somewhere, and that bullying is a dysfunctional response to feeling powerless in school and at home. We have normalized treating children the same way we treat our pets. It's normal for teachers to use shaming language and yelling to manage a classroom of rowdy students. We use clickers to count how many times students interrupt the teachers, take away recess if they are too frisky in class, encourage them to go for extra credit, and gauge their value based on how well they follow the rules and how much they're willing to do beyond the regular work in the classroom. 6.1 million children in the United States alone are diagnosed with ADD/ADHD, a diagnosis rate that is not supported by postmortem studies that show that the actual rate of brain changes consistent with ADD/ADHD is closer to 0.01% of the population. I could go on and on with a list of how the system is broken, but I want to end on an inspired note. Years ago, I taught a parenting class. I would share with my students that children rise to meet the level of expectation from their parents. If you believe in children and treat them as if you trust them, they will do the right thing and, more likely than not, act accordingly. In Howard Gardner's original research on multiple intelligences, he came up with over 100 different kinds of giftedness that children exhibit. He was told to narrow it down because he couldn't construct an education system complex enough to meet all the needs of all the different ways of learning. What if we can? What if the pathway to incorporating all these ways of learning is to let the children lead us, to let us know what they need and how we can support them as they follow their natural, adaptive way of activating the right educational path for them? What if we trust that children contain within them a deep connection to their own inner wisdom that sparks them to follow their innate and natural path of learning, the one that is theirs to follow? What if we redefine the parameters of success and the skill set necessary for adulthood and instead give children the space, freedom, and support to grow into the people they were born to be? What if the key to creating a new economy rooted in a success metric that measures quality of life and quantity of well-being starts with raising children in a way that normalizes these metrics? Thank you for joining me for Quantum Revolution. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss any of the amazing shows we have in store for you. If you'd like to learn more about how you can connect to your innate wisdom and live a life rooted in well-being, please visit our website, www.quantumalignmentsystem.com.
Thank you for joining us on Quantum Revolution with Karen Curry Parker. We hope you found this conversation inspiring. For more information on how to change your world and to hear more about our guest today, visit quantumrevolutionpodcast.com. Make sure you follow us on your favorite podcasting platform so you don't miss a single episode of Quantum Revolution. We'll see you next time for some more groundbreaking conversations with Karen and her guests. How will you impact your world today?